Before we start, I'd like to give a massive shout out to the following people for supporting Stories Telling Stories on Patreon: Jim Ross, Holly, Tamara, Tom, and Maddie. Thank you so much for your support. If you'd like to help support the show and hear your name listed before future episodes, head on over to patreon.com/storiestellingstories. What started as a silly idea of mine a little over 3 years ago has morphed into something I could never have anticipated. In episode 1, I finished the silly submarine story that Mrs. Hazeltine shared in the film that inspired this podcast, because I wanted to tell stories. I wanted to write. I wanted to flex my artistic muscles during my theatrical off-season. And now, as the STS podcast is on its 50th episode, I'm taking a moment to reflect on just how far this series has come. The biggest challenge in the last 3 years was the introduction of the pandemic-induced Locked in a Vacancy series. What was originally intended as a mini-series that documented my personal journey through COVID lockdown week by week, sharing classic stories about solitude and isolation rather than crafting my own, has become in a way more of a flagship series than the original STS idea. This marks episode 20 of Locked in a Vacancy. I can't believe it's come this far. But I also can't believe the pandemic has lasted this long, and with no end in sight. Locked in a Vacancy has brought in a massive influx of new listeners, and has become such a gem in its own right that I foresee it outlasting the pandemic and carrying on in its own right well into the future. I've also spent a great deal of time working on ways to continue to expand the quality and variety of content that STS can offer. With new shows in the development stage that explore new formats and styles, from new material to deep dives with the creative minds behind the work, I'm excited for what the next 50 episodes are going to bring our way. That being said, we've still got a few months to go before we wrap up Season 3. So far the biggest season yet. As we shift into October, there's going to be a renewed focus on the terrifying and the macabre as we build towards our annual Halloween special. And as we pass from November into December, the holiday season will take hold, whether we like it or not, and I'll be doing some deep dives into the literary and dramatic archives to make Season 3 extra special. And, as is tradition, we will end Season 3 as December draws to a close with our very special musical episode. But you'll have to wait and see exactly what I've got up my sleeve this year. It's hard to believe that the year is already beginning to wind down. In a lot of ways, I still feel trapped in a perpetual state of March when I began working from home and adjusting to a life lived mostly within my own four walls. Weeks turned into months, and now we're staring down the end of the year. 2020 has been a year for the ages. One that united a lot of the world, but not in the way we would have liked. A year that brought challenge after challenge, month after month, each seemingly more upending than the last, but also not coming as a major surprise to anyone at this point. We will be telling the story of the pandemic years of 2020 and beyond, and what it was like to live through it for the rest of our lives. Decades from now, it will be relegated to the annals of history, with preserved elements of social media becoming almanacs of the human experience. This podcast has become, in a way, my oral history of the year that was 2020, as told through pop culture and literature for a global audience. Will a podcast still exist decades from now? What is the value of social history through data centers that could one day be shut down? Without a living, breathing oral history, how can we hope that our stories will survive? A century from now, when I'm gone, I'm sure my story will disappear with the memory of my person. Unless, somehow, I'm able to tell something profoundly important that can move enough souls to ingrain it into the collective consciousness. But the internet can be shut down. Books can be banned, burned, buried, forgotten, but an idea can live forever as long as we continue to share it. If you look back through civilizations across history, the common thread of shared knowledge is the oral storytelling tradition, passed down from generation to generation. That's how we learned. It's how we grow, teach, entertain, and develop as a people. I've mentioned in the past my affinity for the storytelling traditions of some of my ancestral people of Ireland and Scotland, but I share a deep bond with another string of storytelling in my blood, as a descendant of the Abenaki nation, a collection of tribes native to the northeast region of the United States and Canada. I was exposed to the stories of the Abenaki as a young age, and they have always stuck with me, being the sources of projects and reports in school and stirring my imagination to become a storyteller in my own right. One of my favorite stories is a tale set around the Abenaki demigod Glooscab, or Glooscabi, depending on the tribe, who is known to be something of a trickster. So today, to celebrate 50 episodes of storytelling, here on STS and Locked into Vacancy, I'm going to share a story from the culture of my Native American people. This is Glooscab the Trickster, an Abenaki legend, on Locked into Vacancy. In the old time of Glooscap's people, an old Indian widow and her son Tabulik lived in a wigwam by themselves at some distance from the Maliseet village. Tabulik was a good lad, but awkward with bow and arrow. He could not shoot straight if his life depended on it. He and his mother, therefore, had to live as best they could by trapping and fishing. With hard work, they could just manage, but there was never anything left over. Now the chief of the nearby village demanded a yearly tribute of wampum from all who lived within reach of his land. Wampum, you know, is a kind of Indian money made of shells, and the Indians used it in trading. The people feared the Maliseet chief because he claimed to be a magician and threatened to put an evil spell on the people if they refused to pay. At the time of our story, the tribute was nearly due, and Tabulik and his mother had not a single piece of wampum in their lodge. In desperation, the mother took a treasured moose hide left to her by her husband and told Tabulik to go to the village and trade it for wampum. So off Tabulik went, with the moose hide over his shoulder. He had not gone far when he met an old man who raised his hand and said politely, "Kwai, my son." Tabulik returned the greeting with equal politeness. "I see you have a fine moose hide there," said the old man. "I'm in need of just such an article. Will you give it to me?" Tabulik was sorry to refuse, but explained to the old man that he must sell the hide to get the wampum for the tribute. "Listen now," the old man said coaxingly. "I'll trade you this dish of food for it." Tabulik looked at the dish and saw a tiny portion of ground cooked meal, hardly enough for a good swallow, and shook his head. The old man shrugged and said cheerfully, "Oh, very well then, but taste a little before you go." Out of politeness, Tabulik did so, and found to his surprise that it was delicious. "Have some more," offered the old man slyly. "Willingly," cried Tabulik, and went on eating. To his amazement, no matter how much he ate, and he ate a great deal, there was just as much left in the dish. He ate, and he ate, and at last he had eaten all he wanted and wished to stop. Then, to his horror, he found he had to keep on eating just the same. Oh, how the old man laughed to see Tabulik try to push the dish away, at the same time grabbing the food and stuffing it into his mouth. He laughed till the tears came. "Come," said the old man, gasping, "give me the moose hide, and you may stop eating. Moreover, you may have the dish of food to keep." By this time, Tabulik felt he might burst if he ate another mouthful, so he gladly gave the moose hide to the old fellow, and taking the dish of food in exchange, walked sadly home to his mother to tell her what had happened. Now, I'll tell you something Tabulik did not know. The old man he had met was none other than Glooscab, disguised. The great chief was something of a trickster, you see, and loved now and then to play jokes on his people, especially when by doing so, he could help them. The next day, Tabulik was sent out with another prized article, a fine bear skin. His mother bid him get a better bargain than he had the day before. However, there on the path again was the old man, holding a shabby old belt in his hand. "Will you trade this belt for that skin?" Tabulik took a firmer grip on his fine bearskin. "I should say not. I am not such a fool as that." Instantly, the belt jumped out of the old man's hand and wrapped itself around Tabulik, squeezing him until he cried for mercy. "Take it off! Take it off!" "The belt will come off quick enough," the old man chuckled, "when I have that bearskin in my hand." So, to keep from having the last breath squeezed out of him, Tabulik was obliged to trade the skin for the belt. His mother was scandalized. "You foolish boy," she scolded. "Now we've lost 2 valuable things. All that remains are these 10 muskrat pelts. Take them to the village, Tabulik, and sell them for wampum, or the chief will take our wigwam from over our very heads." Tabulik promised that this time he would avoid the usual path and have nothing to do with the old man. So he took a new way through the depths of the woods and had nearly reached the village when he heard the sound of music. Despite all he could do, his feet turned towards the sound and began to dance of their own accord. He danced and he could not stop, not even when he had danced up to the old man who played on a broken flute. "Stop! Stop!" pleaded Tabulik. "Stop playing!" And he threw the muskrat skins at the old man's feet. The old man stopped playing, handed Tabulik the flute, and laughed till the tears ran down his cheeks. "All right, my son," he said. "Go home now and cheer up. You may have made better bargains than you know." But the mother of Tabulik did not think so. "A morsel of food," she wailed, "a shabby old belt, and a broken flute, for all those fine skins. And see, here comes the chief for the tribute." It was so. The chief, with a band of his braves, approached the wigwam. With a worried heart, but the customary Indian politeness, Tabulik invited the chief to enter the lodge and showed him to the highest place. Having no other food, he offered the chief the dish of food he had got from the old man. The guest looked distasteful, but tasted it, and then his expression changed. Never had he tasted anything so good. He ate, and he ate, and ate, and the more he ate, the more there was. But the trouble was, he could not stop eating, even when his stomach began to hurt dreadfully. "Take it away, or I shall die," he groaned, and Tabulik laughed. He knew just how the chief felt. "I shall take it away," he said boldly, "only when you promise that henceforth you will demand no tribute wampum from me or any of the people." The chief was terribly angry, but he was also in pain. He knew if he ate one more bite he would choke to death. So he gasped out, "Yes, yes, anything you say." But as soon as Tabulik had removed the dish, he shouted to his braves, "Seize this fellow and kill him!" As the braves rushed forward, Tabulik threw down the magic belt, and, quick as a striking snake, it jumped up and wound itself about the lot of them, and not one could stir a muscle. Then the chief saw he was dealing with trickery, and cast about in his mind for a better trick. "Let my men go," he said, "and we will make a bargain." "Tell me what it is first," said Tabulik suspiciously. "I have a daughter," said the chief, "who never smiles, much less laughs. A spell was put upon her by Lox when she was a child." He looked at Tabulik with a sly grin. "If you can cause her to laugh, I will make you my son-in-law, and you and your mother will never know want again. If you fail, however, you will die." Tabulik thought for a moment, then bravely agreed to the bargain. And the chief laughed to himself, for he knew his daughter, and he was sure that Tabulik would fail, and he would be rid of him. Tabulik loosened the braves and accompanied the chief to the village. There, before all the assembled people, the Malasite presented his gloomy daughter to Tabulik. She might have been a pretty maid had not her face stretched from here to here with sulky disdain. Sitting at her feet, Tabulik began to tell a very funny story about an ant and a beaver, and the people laughed heartily, all but the chief's daughter. She just sighed and looked gloomier than ever. So Tabulik told another tale, even funnier than the first. All the people fairly shouted with laughter, but not the tiniest smile appeared on the face of the chief's daughter. In desperation, Tabulik tried standing on his head and making funny faces, but nothing was any good. He had failed. "I should have been glad if you had succeeded," the chief said sourly, "for a gloomy face makes a dreary wigwam. However, you have failed and must pay the penalty." And he gave his braves the signal to kill Tabulik. As the braves advanced upon him, Tabulik snatched up the flute and began to play. At once, the braves began to dance merrily, and not only the braves, but the chief himself, and all of the people, except the chief's daughter, who sat still wrapped in gloom. How they danced! They jigged and they whirled and they bobbed and they bounced. Fat and thin, short and tall, they all skipped about. And though they gasped for breath and wept with anger, they could not stop. It was a very funny sight indeed. Suddenly, a sound was heard above the music. It was the sound of laughter. Tabulik left off playing and stared at the chief's daughter. She was laughing. She was laughing so hard, she rocked back and forth and the tears ran down her cheeks. When the music ceased and all collapsed to the ground, she laughed harder than ever. "Take her," gasped the chief. "You have won. It is clear that you are a magician, and your magic is stronger than mine." The people thought so too, for they made Tabulik their chief instead. And since the old chief's daughter was now as cheerful as the summer sun, Tabulik married her, and they had many children. Only one thing puzzled Tabulik. Why, when he played the flute, had the chief's daughter not danced too? But then, you see, he didn't know of Glooscab's part in the affair. And Glooscab really is a great magician. Kes piduxit. The story ends. The end. Locked in a Vacancy is produced in collaboration with Stories Telling Stories and STS Media Group, socially isolating itself at Milt House Studios in Milton, Vermont, casting around the globe to your frontal lobe wherever podcasts are found. Locked in a Vacancy is also streaming on YouTube at Stories Telling Stories. Make sure to give us a review wherever you stream our show. We really appreciate it. Make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, give us a subscribe on YouTube, and consider supporting us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. And until next time, stay sane, stay safe, and stay whimsical.